According to scholars, archaeologists, and modern accepted theory, the origins of human civilization started within the Fertile Crescent, beginning with the Sumerians in ancient Mesopotamia, followed shortly by the Egyptians in ancient Egypt. Now, in both Egypt and Sumer, archaeologists have discovered a quote-unquote king's list, and in both cases, scholars use said king's list as the basis for the chronology of kings and overall timeline for each civilization. However, in both cases, each of the kings listed prior to 3000 BC, scholars consider to be mythical or symbolic, which brings me to my question: why? And in order for us to answer that question, we need to first understand the king's list. So let's do that with a quick 20-second breakdown. The Sumerian Kings List is a collection of several ancient tablets listing the dynasty of kings and when they ruled, which begins with the antediluvian rulers, or those who ruled before the flood, including the lengths of years they ruled, which ranged from 18,000 to 43,000 years. The Turing Kings List, or Egyptian royal canon, consists of 160 fragments of an ancient papyrus scroll that lists every king and pharaoh up until Ramses II. Broken up into 11 columns, the first two list the first kings of Egypt, like Osiris and Horus, who ruled over Egypt nearly 34,000 years ago.
Then writing. The gods of Mesopotamia ruled when civilization was just beginning to take shape in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Their worship coincides with the birth of the wheel, irrigation, and written language over 5,000 years ago. But you might be surprised to learn that even if you've never before heard their names, some of their stories are eerily familiar. An important caveat. The Mesopotamian pantheon was around for a long time, and this religion was practiced by many different cultures across hundreds of miles and thousands of years. Each culture had its own slightly different take on how they practiced religion, so there are no definitive versions of these stories. For instance, there can be quite a bit of overlap between the duties of different gods and which gods are most important. When the Sumerians first adopted the religion, different cities had different patron deities, and so when certain cities like Akkad or Assur or Babylon built their empires, their patron deity became way more important and often adopted the qualities of gods that used to be more important in different cities. In short, there is no Mesopotamian Bible to give us a single definitive canon. Now, with that disclaimer behind us, let's turn our attention to the top of the chart. Abzu and Tiamat are the primal gods, and they present an interesting cosmology. Unlike other religions that feature either a creator or perhaps personifications of the earth and the sky, the first beings Abzu and Tiamat were the personifications of fresh water and salt water. Tiamat, the glistening one, is the raging sea, the monstrous embodiment of primordial chaos. Abzu, her husband, was the king of the primeval freshwater sea beneath the world from which all aquifers draw their life-giving water. These two waters mixed, and Tiamat bore the stars in the heavens, and they in turn begat Anshar and Kishar. Not much information survives about these two, but they're the first instance, both within this family tree as well as historically, of a very popular trope among many polytheistic religions, that of the Sky Father and Earth Mother. Their children, Anu and Ki, are another form of this same trope. Much like with the Greek Titans and Olympians, they fulfill the same role as their parents. Anu was the supreme god, but despite this, he was rarely worshipped and sort of fell into the background. His most important role in society, rather than being a god of the sky, was being sort of the god of divinity itself. He transferred divine authority to kings on earth and gods alike. His wife Ki has a couple of identities, having once been called Urash and later being supplanted by Antu, though they're all more or less the same person. She was goddess of the earth, and it was believed that the rain was Anu's seed, and that when the rain came down, the earth became pregnant, and Ki thereby gave birth to all things. Alongside the plants, Ki gave birth to the Anunnaki, who are sort of like the Olympians or the Aesir of Norse mythology. Their name means the ones who decree, because they were believed to hold the fates of humans in their hands. The two most important of the Anunnaki were the brothers Enlil and Enki. Enlil, in contrast to his father, was worshipped a lot. He was seen as the ultimate benevolent father figure and was so holy that even certain other gods couldn't look upon him. He was responsible for the creation of civilization, and his temple was the anchor between heaven and earth. His wife was Ninlil, who was the Lady of the Wind, or Lady of the Open Field. When they met, Enlil seduced Ninlil by the riverside, and they conceived Nanar, god of the moon. Enlil was then sent to the underworld for his ritually impure relationship with Ninlil, but she follows him. Along the way, she encounters Enlil 3 more times, disguised as the gatekeeper of the city he's left, the river of the underworld, and the underworld's ferryman, an element of the Mesopotamian religion that would later find itself integrated into Greek mythology. Each time, Ninlil is seduced and impregnated with a new deity, a god of canals, a god with a curious dual association with both the underworld as well as healing, and most importantly, the god of death, Nergal. Enlil is also important in the Mesopotamian flood myth, another point of similarity with later religions. Originally, the story went that there was a great flood, and Enlil rewarded the sole survivor, Utnapishtim, with immortality. But in later tellings, he was the cause of the flood himself. Enlil couldn't sleep because there were too many humans on the earth making noise, so he decided to kill every living thing with a flood. His brother Enki warned Utnapishtim of the oncoming flood, so he and his family became the only survivors. Enlil was furious to see humans still walking the earth, but his son Ninurta and his granddaughter Inanna convince him to promise never to flood the earth again, and instead to periodically cull the human population with wild animals and famines. So, hooray? And then he briefly went to see the humans, and they treated him with respect in spite of, or maybe because of, the apocalypse he just inflicted, so he blesses Utnapishtim with immortality. This was very much an explanation myth more so than a moral fable. The other primary Anunnaki, Enki, is a god of creation, as well as a trickster, at times heroic, at times villainous, and other times just plain lazy. He's a central figure in the creation of humanity. Once upon a time, Abzu was growing old and tired, but he was disturbed by the ruckus of the younger gods, and so he set out to destroy them. The gods found out about this, and Enki stepped forward as their point guard. He placed Abzu in a deep sleep and carried him deep underground. This begged the question, who would care for Abzu's primordial waters while he slept? So Enki dove deep down to the freshwater sea beneath the earth to rule Abzu's realm in his stead. Tiamat was not happy with their children usurping Abzu, so she transformed into a terrifying dragon in order to destroy the world herself. This time, Enki chooses to do nothing, because apparently putting one elder god to rest was as much as he could muster, so Enlil stepped up to slay the dragon. He tore her body apart, making the vault of the heavens with her ribs and the Milky Way with her tail. But of course, she couldn't truly be killed, and so she carried on living in that disfigured form, and from her crying eyes sprang forth the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. Once again, the question arose, without Tiamat, who would keep the cosmos working as intended? And this time, Enki came back with a clever solution. The gods would create servants from clay to tend to the earth. That's us. But Enki was also promiscuous and deceitful. In one very sordid tale, Enki has an affair with Ninhursag, a fertility goddess, but eventually she left him. Some years later, Enki is still lonely and missing his lost lover when who should appear but a beautiful young woman who looks just like her. Enki at once seduces her, not knowing that this woman was the daughter he had with Ninhursag. Well, she eventually leaves him, and time goes by, and Enki is again stewing in his loneliness when he meets another beautiful young maiden. This is also his daughter, and also his granddaughter. Years go by, and there's a third mysterious young woman who looks very much like Ninhursag, even though, going by DNA, she would be 87.5% Enki. Ninhursag finds out what's happened and undoes it, then sets out to turn the tables on Enki. His whole body begins to swell, and he seems to be dying until Ninhursag takes mercy and removes the swelling from him, creating gods of healing for each part of the body afflicted. Aside from that ultimate incestuous line, Enki had a son named Marduk, who became the patron god of Babylon. He used to be a very minor god until the reign of Hammurabi, in which Babylon conquered much of the Fertile Crescent. Marduk then took on the roles and myths of Enki and Enlil. According to Babylonian tradition, it was Marduk who slayed Abzu and defeated Tiamat. He's also associated with the planet Jupiter, and so is sometimes seen as the equivalent to the Roman Jupiter, though the similarities are limited. Returning to Enlil and Ninlil's side of the tree, their son Ninurta is associated with farming and healing, whether that's alleviating sickness or driving out demons. He's associated with the planet Saturn and the Roman Saturn, aka Cronus. Again, it's not an exact match, but they do share similar themes of farming and the passage of time, and eventually Ninurta became associated with war as well. He enjoyed much popularity during the Neo-Assyrian Empire, during a time when the empire was largely henotheistic. That means they acknowledged the existence of many gods, but only worshipped one, in this case usually the god Ashur, who was likely the Assyrian equivalent of Enlil. But after the fall of the empire, Ninurta had become too closely associated with the oppressive, warlike regime, so his statues were torn down and he faded once again into obscurity. Though sometimes presented as the son of Ninlil, there are other stories in which he's the son of Ninursag. That's because, after defeating a mighty army with the help of his talking mace, he used his enemy's fallen stone soldiers to construct the mountains and the hills, dedicating them to his mother, whom he renamed Ninursag, which means Lady of the Mountain. He's also known for defeating the Anzu, a giant bird that stole his father Enlil's Tablet of Destinies, the object which denoted his divine right to rule. Ninurta shot the bird with arrows, but the tablet had the ability to turn back time, so the arrow's shaft turned to Cain, the flint heads returned to the quarry, and the feathers turned to birds. I find this particularly interesting, as most classical or medieval stories depicting any kind of time travel are almost always moving forward in time, and nearly anything about going backwards is much more recent. Ultimately, he summons a wind that rips the bird's wings off, and then he slits its throat. And in some versions, he ends up desiring further glory and attempts to take over the world, but Enki defeats him with a giant turtle that nips at his ankles. Next we have Nanar, who's a little unique in being a moon god rather than a moon goddess. He's also named Sin, but not because he was evil, it just happens that was the name he took in the ancient Semitic polytheistic religion. He has a beard of lapis lazuli and rides a winged bull, but other than that, we don't know too much about him, because his time in the spotlight was when was the most powerful of the Sumerian city-states, which was around 2600 to 2400 BCE. However, the famous ziggurat of was dedicated to him, so he still has that distinguishment. Okay, now before we get to Gilgamesh and his mother, let's quickly run through the final generation of the Anunnaki. Nabu is the son of Marduk and is the god of wisdom, writing, and prophecies. He's associated with the planet Mercury and sometimes with the god Mercury, both being gods of wisdom and messages, though he shares some characteristics with Apollo as a giver of prophecies. Inanna, otherwise known as Ishtar, is a very important goddess, and the one about whom we have the most information, but to do justice to her would require an entire other video. Luckily, this video is being made in collaboration with Mythology with Mike, who's created an entire video all about her, so I'll just cover the basics. She was the goddess of love and beauty, much like her Roman counterpart Venus, but also goddess of war, justice, and political power. And one day, she was courted by two minor deities, one a shepherd and the other a farmer. She initially likes the farmer, but is persuaded to pick the shepherd because he can give her the better gifts, a setup similar to the story of Cain and Abel in the Bible. Anyway, that shepherd is Dumuzid, and they live happily ever after until Inanna decides to descend to the underworld and finds herself trapped there like many who've come before her. Dumuzid fails to mourn her properly, so when Inanna eventually breaks out and returns to the overworld, the demons demand a replacement. Inanna sees what Dumazid's been up to and offers him to be dragged down, but eventually she takes pity on him, and so she works out a deal where he'll spend half the year in the underworld and half on the surface, which explains seasons. And yes, for those keeping track at home, this is a likely inspiration for the myth of Persephone in Hades. Next is Inanna's twin brother Utu. Utu was trying to help Dumazid when the demons came to drag him to the netherworld because he is the god of justice. He's also the god of the sun, riding a chariot across the sky during the day and traveling through the underworld at night. His position from the sky allows him to see everything on Earth and therefore to enforce justice, truth, and morality among mortals. A fun fact about him, there is actually a carved portrait of Utu in the U.S. House chamber, just above the gallery doors. In 1950, they installed the portraits of famous lawmakers and philosophers, and this one, of Hammurabi, was based off of this figure in the Hammurabi stele, sitting on his throne and wearing a spiraling hat. However, the man sitting on the throne isn't Hammurabi. In all of Hammurabi's depictions, he's got this round hat that looks like a helmet, whereas Utu, who has a higher station than a king, is depicted in a throne wearing his spiraling hat. And finally, there's Ereshkigal and Nergal. Nergal, as I mentioned earlier, is a son of Enlil and Ninlil, and Ereshkigal is Inanna and Utu's older sister, though she's not really associated with them that often, aside from the story about Inanna's descent into the underworld. Her primary myth is about her marriage. One day, there is a banquet that Ereshkigal can't visit because she's queen of the underworld, and the other gods don't want to throw a party down there because people have a tendency of getting trapped. So, Ereshkigal sends someone on her behalf. At the party, Nergal is rude to Ereshkigal's envoy, so she summons him to the underworld. He's told that if he ever wants to make it out alive, he cannot eat, drink, wash, or sit in Ereshkigal's kingdom. But he also can't sleep with the goddess of the underworld, and that turns out to be more challenging for him. He tries to leave after having an affair with her, but she drags him back down even after he tries to disguise himself. But despite initially being called down to the underworld as punishment, the two get married and Nergal becomes king of the underworld. Okay, we're